Right now, in hives that look completely fine from the outside, something is quietly building toward a collapse that most beekeepers won't even notice until it's already too late to stop it. It doesn't look dramatic at first. It doesn't look like starvation. It doesn't look like a queen problem. It looks like 2 or 3 bees crawling awkwardly near the entrance, wings twisted and shriveled like crumpled paper, unable to fly, dragging themselves in slow circles on the landing board while the rest of the colony carries on as if nothing is wrong. If you see that in July and you assume it's nothing, there is a very real chance that same hive will be dead, or so weak it might as well be dead, before the end of August. Not because of anything dramatic that happens later, because of something that has already happened, weeks before you noticed, and is now moving too fast to reverse. I've watched this exact pattern play out more times than I can count, in my own apiary early on, and in the apiaries of beekeepers I've mentored who called me in a panic in September asking what went wrong, when the real answer was sitting right there in July if anyone had known to look for it. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what that sign actually means, why July specifically is the month it shows up, and precisely what to do the moment you spot it, before your window to fix it closes completely. If you keep bees anywhere in a temperate climate, this is one of those videos you genuinely cannot afford to skip, because the entire value of it depends on catching this early, not after the fact. And if you want more of this kind of practical, decades-earned beekeeping knowledge every single week, go ahead and subscribe right now, because that's exactly what this channel is built around. My name is Steve, and what I'm about to walk you through today is the single most common reason a healthy-looking July hive turns into a September disaster. We're going to cover 5 things. First, exactly what that crawling, twisted-wing bee is actually telling you, and why it's the tip of a much bigger iceberg. Second, a bit of history on where this parasite even came from, because understanding that changes how seriously you take it. Third, why July specifically, out of every month in the beekeeping calendar, is when this problem crosses its point of no return. Fourth, the handful of other signs that confirm what's really happening, including how to tell it apart from a couple of lookalike problems that trip up even experienced beekeepers. And finally, exactly what I do the moment I see it, step by step, including the one longer-term move that actually reduces how often this happens to you in future seasons. Let's start with what that bee is actually showing you, because this is the part almost nobody explains properly. That twisted, shriveled wing isn't some random genetic defect or a one-off injury. It's the visible expression of a virus called deformed wing virus, and it doesn't spread through the colony on its own. It's carried and transmitted directly by Varroa mites, a parasite that lives on adult bees and reproduces inside sealed brood cells, feeding on developing pupae before they ever emerge. When a mite feeds on a developing bee, it can transmit that virus directly into the pupa's body at exactly the stage when its wings are still forming. The bee that emerges afterward isn't sick in some vague, general sense. It is a bee whose wings were permanently and visibly damaged before it ever took its first flight, walking proof that a mite fed on it during development. Here's the part that matters most. By the time you can actually see one of these bees crawling near your entrance, you are not looking at the beginning of a mite problem. You are looking at the visible tip of a mite population that has already grown large enough for long enough that damaged bees are now emerging in noticeable numbers. It's worth understanding for a moment where this parasite actually came from, because it explains why our bees are so poorly equipped to deal with it in the first place. Varroa mites didn't originally evolve alongside the honeybee most of us keep. They evolved alongside a different species, the Asian honeybee, which developed its own natural defenses against them over a very long shared history. Sometime in the middle of the last century, as beekeeping practices moved colonies of our common western honeybee into closer contact with Asian honeybee populations, the mite made the jump onto a completely new host species that had never developed any real natural resistance to it. From there, it spread, quite literally, around the entire world, carried along by the global movement of bees, queens, and beekeeping equipment, until it reached nearly every beekeeping region on Earth within just a few decades. Interestingly, for a long time researchers actually believed there was only one species of Varroa mite involved in all of this, until closer genetic study eventually revealed that the specific mite devastating western honeybee colonies worldwide was actually a distinct species from the one originally described on the Asian honeybee, close enough in appearance to be mistaken for its relative for years, but genetically its own separate lineage entirely, with its own specific adaptations for parasitizing exactly the kind of colony you're probably keeping in your own backyard right now. That history matters because it means the bees most of us keep today are still, in evolutionary terms, extremely new to this parasite. They have not had anywhere near enough generations to develop the kind of natural resistance the Asian honeybee built up over a much longer shared history. Every year, we are essentially managing a still ongoing arms race on the bees' behalf, because evolution alone hasn't caught up yet. Varroa populations inside a colony don't grow steadily in a straight line. They grow exponentially, roughly doubling with each full brood cycle, which typically runs about 3 to 4 weeks. A mite population that seemed genuinely low and unremarkable back in May can, without any single dramatic event, cross into a full-blown infestation by the middle of summer, simply because exponential growth looks harmless for a long time, right up until it suddenly doesn't. This is exactly why July is the specific month this shows up, and why it's so much more dangerous in July than it would be, say, in April or in October. Through spring, brood rearing ramps up fast, which gives mites plenty of new cells to reproduce in, but the overall population is still relatively small, and the colony's own bee population is growing quickly enough to dilute the visible impact. By the time you get into July, that mite population has had a full 2 to 3 brood cycles to compound on itself, and the exponential curve is no longer sitting flat. It's climbing steeply. And this is happening at the exact same time as one of the most dangerous overlaps in the entire beekeeping calendar. Because July is also, in most regions, when the main nectar flow slows down or stops entirely, moving into what beekeepers call a summer dearth. That combination is what makes this specific month so dangerous. A colony under mite pressure heading into a dearth is a colony that's simultaneously fighting a parasite population explosion, losing its normal food income from the outside, and about to start rearing the specific generation of long-lived bees that need to physically survive all the way through winter. If that winter bee generation is being reared right as the mite population peaks, those bees don't just look a little worse for wear. Research into deformed wing virus has consistently shown that bees affected by it, even those that don't show obvious visible wing damage, tend to have measurably shortened lifespans and reduced ability to perform normal hive tasks. A colony can look functional in July, with plenty of visible activity at the entrance, and still be actively producing the specific generation of workers that will not survive to see the following spring, simply because they emerged during the exact window when mite pressure was at its highest. This is also exactly why the collapse tends to show up in August or September rather than immediately in July. The bees emerging right now, compromised or otherwise, are still functional enough in the short term to keep the hive looking normal from the outside. It's only a few weeks later, once population turnover catches up and the colony needs those bees to actually perform at full capacity, or needs them to survive into the cold months, that the compounding damage becomes visible as a sudden, often shockingly fast collapse. Beekeepers frequently describe this exact pattern using the phrase mite bomb, because from the outside it looks sudden and unexplained, when in reality it was building for 2 months before anyone noticed. I lost a hive to exactly this, years ago, in a way that still bothers me a little every July. It was a strong colony that spring, one of the best producers in the yard, drawing comb fast and bringing in a heavy spring flow. I remember seeing a single crawling bee near the entrance sometime in early July and telling myself it was probably just an injury from a robbing skirmish with a neighboring hive. I didn't do a mite count. I didn't look closely at the bottom board. By late August, that same hive had gone from one of my strongest to barely a double handful of bees clinging to 2 frames, and by the time I actually pulled a mite sample, the count was high enough that there was nothing left to meaningfully treat. That single ignored bee in July was the entire story. Everything that happened afterward was just that story playing out. So if a twisted wing on one or two bees is the first visible clue, how do you actually confirm what's going on, rather than just guessing based on a couple of crawling insects? There are several other signs worth checking, and together they paint a much clearer picture than any single symptom on its own. The first is what's happening on your bottom board, if you're running a screened bottom board, or simply pull the solid one out for an inspection. Mites that fall naturally off adult bees, or that a colony's hygienic bees actively groom off and drop, will accumulate there. A small handful of mites, scattered across a sticky board over a couple of days, is normal background noise in almost any hive. A noticeably heavier scattering, especially combined with visible mite frass, which looks like tiny pale specks inside empty brood cells, is a strong secondary confirmation that the population inside the colony has grown well beyond a manageable background level. The second is what beekeepers call bald brood, which is brood comb where the cappings have been chewed open, leaving pupae partially exposed rather than neatly sealed. This happens when hygienic worker bees detect an infested cell and attempt to remove the compromised pupa themselves. A small amount of this kind of activity can actually be a good sign, showing your bees have some genuine hygienic behavior working in their favor. A large amount of it spread across multiple frames tells you the mite pressure has become severe enough that the colony's own defenses are being pushed right to their limit, working overtime just to keep pace. The third is a spotty, irregular brood pattern rather than the tight, uniform pattern a healthy queen normally produces. While a patchy pattern can have several different causes, a queen that was previously laying a solid, consistent pattern, suddenly shifting to a scattered one in the middle of summer, combined with any of the other signs we've just covered, points strongly toward mite-related brood mortality, rather than a simple queen issue on its own. It's also worth checking whether the queen herself looks smaller, slower, or less active than she did earlier in the season, since a colony under heavy mite and viral pressure will often supersede a queen that would otherwise have been perfectly fine, simply because the underlying stress on the whole colony makes her look like the problem when she isn't. And the fourth, the one that actually gives you a real number instead of a guess, is doing an actual mite count. This takes about 5 minutes, and it's the single most useful 5 minutes you can spend in your apiary all season. Here's exactly how I do it, the same way, every single time, so my numbers stay comparable from one check to the next. I fill a wide-mouth jar about a third full of either rubbing alcohol or windshield washer fluid rated for cold weather, since either one kills mites quickly without excessive fumes. I shake a frame gently over an open container to knock bees loose, then scoop directly from the top of the cluster, avoiding the frame with the queen entirely, until I've got roughly 300 bees, which is about half a standard measuring cup, packed loosely. Those bees go straight into the jar, lid on, and I give it a firm shake for about a minute, which is long enough for the alcohol to dislodge mites clinging to the bees without needing to shake it for some drawn-out ordeal. Then I pour the contents through a mesh strainer or a modified lid with holes drilled into it, over a white surface or a paper plate, so the reddish-brown mites show up clearly against the pale background. I count what's on the plate, divide by 3, and that's my mite count per 100 bees for that specific hive on that specific day. If you'd rather not kill the sample, the powdered sugar version works the same way, just with a few tablespoons of powdered sugar shaken into the jar instead of liquid, followed by rolling and shaking for a couple of minutes before straining the sugar and any dislodged mites through a mesh lid into water, which dissolves the sugar and leaves the mites visible on the surface. It's slightly less accurate because a portion of mites tend to stay gripped onto the bees even after a thorough shake, but it lets you return every one of those 300 bees straight back into the hive afterward, which matters if you're checking a smaller colony where you don't want to sacrifice a meaningful chunk of the population just to get a number. A number that would have been perfectly tolerable in May can represent a genuinely dangerous, fast-worsening situation by the time you're looking at it in July, precisely because of how quickly that exponential growth curve moves once it gets going. Before we move on to what you actually do about a high count, I want to clear up something that trips up a lot of beekeepers looking at a crawling bee for the first time, because not every bee with something visibly wrong with its wings is dealing with varroa and deformed wing virus specifically, and misreading which problem you're actually looking at can send you down the wrong fix entirely. A bee affected by deformed wing virus typically shows wings that are shrunken, crumpled, or twisted in an irregular, asymmetric way, often paired with a noticeably smaller, shortened abdomen, and the bee is usually found crawling on the ground or on the landing board because it genuinely cannot fly, not because it's simply resting. Compare that to what beekeepers call K-wing, where a bee's wings are held out at an odd angle from the body, almost like the letter K, but the wings themselves are otherwise intact and undamaged. K-wing is more commonly associated with tracheal mites, or occasionally with a heavy viral load of a different kind, and while it's still worth investigating, it points you toward a different diagnostic path than deformed wing virus does.
Then there's simple physical damage from robbing conflicts or from bees getting caught and injured during your own inspection, which tends to show up as a torn or missing section of wing rather than the shrunken, crumpled appearance characteristic of viral damage, and usually appears as an isolated case rather than a repeating pattern across multiple bees over several days. And finally, there's pesticide exposure, which can cause bees to tremble, crawl in disoriented circles, or die in unusually large numbers directly in front of the hive entrance, sometimes with wings held in an unusual position, but typically arriving suddenly, in large numbers, often after a nearby agricultural spraying event, rather than building gradually over the preceding weeks the way a mite-driven viral problem does. Getting this distinction right matters, because a pesticide kill needs a completely different response than a mite problem does. And treating for mites when the real issue is chemical exposure wastes time you don't have while the actual cause goes completely unaddressed. Now let's talk about what I actually do the moment I see any combination of these signs, because identifying the problem is only useful if it changes what happens next. The first thing I do is the mite count itself, immediately, on every hive in the yard, not just the one where I noticed a crawling bee. If one hive in an apiary has crossed into dangerous mite territory, it is extremely common for that hive to already be actively spreading mites to its neighbors through robbing behavior and simple drifting, where foragers occasionally return to the wrong hive nearby. Treating one hive while ignoring the 3 sitting next to it is treating the symptom while leaving the actual source of reinfestation completely untouched. The second thing I do is choose a treatment based on the actual season, not just whatever product happens to be sitting in my supply shed. Summer treatment options need to account for 2 things a lot of beekeepers overlook: outdoor temperature limits, since several common treatments have specific temperature ranges they need to stay within to be both safe for the bees and effective against the mites, and the fact that you may still have honey supers on that you don't want contaminated. This is exactly the kind of detail worth checking against your specific treatment's label and your local extension service recommendations for your climate, because using the wrong option at the wrong temperature can do real damage to a colony that's already under stress rather than helping it. The third thing I do, and this is the step most beekeepers skip entirely, is treat early enough to protect the specific generation of bees that will become this year's winter cluster. Depending on your region, that generation is typically being reared sometime between late summer and early fall. If you wait until you see an obvious problem in September to finally treat, you have already lost the window to protect the bees that actually need to survive the winter, because they were reared and already compromised weeks before you acted. Treating in July, the moment you catch this sign, isn't just about saving the colony you can see struggling right now. It's specifically about protecting the bees that haven't been born yet, the ones that will determine whether this hive is even alive to see spring. There are several broad categories of treatment available, and each one has its own trade-offs worth understanding, rather than just grabbing whatever's cheapest at the local supply store. Some options work primarily on mites riding around on adult bees, which means they're less effective while a large amount of brood is still sealed and protecting mites inside it. Others are able to penetrate capped brood cells directly, which tends to make them more thorough, but often comes with tighter temperature windows for safe application. Organic acid-based treatments have become popular specifically because many beekeepers prefer not to leave synthetic residues in wax that will later hold either brood or honey, though they typically require more precise attention to outdoor temperature and humidity to work both safely and effectively. None of this needs to be complicated, but it does mean the right choice in July, during a hot dearth with supers potentially still on, is often a genuinely different choice than what you'd reach for during a cooler fall treatment window with supers already removed. Here's something that catches a lot of beekeepers off guard, especially ones who found a treatment that worked well years ago and have simply stuck with it ever since. Mite populations in many regions have developed genuine resistance to certain older synthetic treatments, particularly a class of chemicals called pyrethroids, which were once the default first choice across the industry decades ago. That resistance didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen everywhere at the same rate, but it happened specifically because those same products were used repeatedly, year after year, as the only treatment in rotation, giving surviving mites every opportunity to pass resistance on to the next generation. This is exactly why I never assume a treatment worked just because I applied it.
I do a follow-up mite count roughly 2 to 3 weeks after treatment, using the same method as before, specifically to confirm the count actually dropped, rather than simply trusting the label on the box. If a treatment that used to knock a count down from 15 to 2 is now only getting you from 15 to 11, that's not a sign to apply it more aggressively. That's a sign local resistance has developed, and it's time to rotate to a genuinely different class of treatment for at least a season or two, giving the resistant mites less advantage to build on. The fourth thing I do is combine treatment with a close look at the colony's overall strength, because a heavily mite-stressed hive going into a summer dearth is also at serious risk of the robbing behavior we've talked about in previous videos. A weakened colony with reduced defensive numbers is an easy target for stronger neighboring hives or wasps looking for an easy meal during a period when natural forage has dried up. If I'm treating a struggling hive in July, I'm also reducing its entrance down to something it can actually defend, and I'm watching it daily rather than checking in once a week like I might with a strong, healthy colony. In practice, that means dropping the entrance opening down to a space small enough for only 1 or 2 bees to pass through at once, which gives a handful of guard bees a realistic chance of actually defending it, compared to a wide-open entrance that a determined wasp or a robbing scout from a stronger hive can simply walk past unchallenged. I'm also watching specifically for the telltale signs of an active robbing attempt already underway, which looks distinctly different from normal foraging traffic. Normal traffic is bees flying directly in and out in a fairly calm, purposeful line. Robbing looks like bees hovering and weaving in front of the entrance before landing, occasional short physical scuffles right at the entrance itself, and a scattering of fresh wax cappings on the landing board or ground below, torn off honeycomb by bees that have already breached the hive and are actively cutting into stores. Catching that pattern in its first few minutes and closing the entrance down immediately is often the difference between a stressed hive that survives and one that gets stripped completely within a single afternoon. And the fifth thing I do, if the population has already dropped significantly by the time I catch it, is make an honest call about whether that specific hive is realistically salvageable this season, or whether the better long-term move is combining it with a stronger colony, rather than watching it limp along at a fraction of its normal strength through a season it was never going to recover from anyway. That's not a fun decision to make, but a small, heavily compromised colony merged into a strong one very often survives winter, where the same bees left alone in a failing hive frequently do not. And the sixth thing, which isn't a response to this particular July, but a decision that changes how often you end up filming a video exactly like this one in future summers, is paying attention to which of your colonies never seem to hit this crisis point at all. Every season, across a yard of multiple hives treated and managed identically, some colonies consistently run lower mite counts than their neighbors without you doing anything differently for them specifically. That's not luck. That's a queen whose daughters show stronger hygienic behavior, more actively detecting and removing infested brood before mites inside it ever get a chance to reproduce and emerge. If you requeen at all during a season, and you have the choice, raising your own queens from your lowest count, most consistently healthy colonies, rather than simply ordering replacement queens from wherever's convenient,
is how you gradually shift your entire apiary's baseline resistance over several years, instead of fighting the exact same uphill mite battle every single July indefinitely. It won't replace monitoring or treatment in any single season, but it's the difference between managing this problem forever and slowly needing to manage it less. I know some of you watching this are firmly in the treatment-free camp, and I'm not here to tell you that's an invalid way to keep bees. But I do want to be straight with you about what that choice actually means in a situation like the one we're describing today, because I don't think it gets talked about honestly very often. Going treatment-free doesn't mean mites stop being a problem. It means you're choosing to let natural selection do the filtering instead of a chemical treatment, which is a legitimate long-term breeding strategy, but it comes with a real, upfront cost that a lot of newer treatment-free beekeepers don't fully budget for emotionally or financially. In practice, that cost usually looks like losing a meaningful percentage of your colonies in the years before your surviving stock actually builds up genuine resistance. Because the whole method depends on the mite-susceptible colonies dying off so that only the naturally hygienic, resistant ones are left to breed from. If you're running 1 or 2 hives in your backyard, that math can be brutal, since losing your only colony isn't a data point in a larger breeding program, it's just losing your bees. Treatment-free approaches tend to work best at a larger scale, with enough colonies that losses become information you can learn from, rather than the end of your beekeeping altogether. And ideally, alongside deliberately selecting and breeding from whichever colonies do show natural resistance, rather than simply hoping for the best and doing nothing differently at all. If that's genuinely the path you want to take, at minimum, still do the mite counts we just walked through. Not to decide whether to treat, but to actually track which of your colonies are handling mite pressure well on their own. So your non-intervention is an informed, deliberate breeding choice rather than just an absence of information. I want to be completely honest with you about a couple of things before we wrap up, because I don't want this video to leave you panicking over a single bee you saw once and never saw again. Occasionally spotting one bee with a slightly damaged wing, especially right after a hive inspection where bees can get accidentally nicked or bumped, is not automatically a 5-alarm emergency. What actually matters is the pattern. Multiple bees showing the same twisted, shriveled wing appearance, especially combined with any of the secondary signs we covered, spread out over several days rather than a single isolated bee on a single afternoon, is what tells you this is a genuine population-level issue rather than an isolated injury. It's also worth saying that the exact timing of this pattern shifts depending on where you keep bees. Everything I've described assumes a fairly typical temperate climate, with a defined spring buildup, a summer dearth, and a real winter afterward. If you're keeping bees somewhere like the northern half of the US or Canada, or across most of the UK and Northern Europe, July genuinely is close to the peak danger window I've described, since your dearth and your winter bee rearing period line up almost exactly the way I've laid out. If you're further south, in a milder climate with a longer nectar season and a shorter, gentler winter, that exact overlap tends to shift later, often into August or September instead, simply because your colony's timeline for rearing long-lived winter bees starts later in the year. And if you're keeping bees in the southern hemisphere, in Australia or South Africa or similar regions, your entire calendar is flipped relative to everything I've said. Meaning, your equivalent danger window likely falls in your local January or February rather than July at all. The lesson isn't panic specifically in July. The lesson is, understand your own local nectar flow and brood cycle well enough to know when your version of this exact overlap is likely to happen, and check for it deliberately rather than waiting to stumble across it by accident. When in doubt, the mite count is what removes the guesswork entirely, and it takes less time than most inspections do anyway. So here's the short version of everything we just covered. A twisted, shriveled wing on a crawling bee in July isn't a small cosmetic issue you can safely ignore. It's the visible evidence of a mite population that has already grown large enough to start damaging developing bees. At the exact moment those mites are compounding fastest, and right as your colony is about to rear the specific generation that needs to survive winter. Confirm it with a real mite count rather than a guess.
Treat based on your actual season and temperature, not whatever's convenient. And act now, because the bees that will determine whether this hive survives winter are being reared in the next few weeks, whether you act on this information or not. I want to know what you're seeing in your own hives right now. Scroll down and tell me your current mite count, if you've checked recently, or tell me if this is the first time you've heard the connection between what's happening in July and what shows up in September. Because I guarantee a lot of you have seen this exact bee before and had no idea what it actually meant. If this video just changed how closely you're going to look at your hives this week, hit subscribe, because next week I'm covering the other side of this exact same problem. The beekeepers who treat aggressively every single year on a fixed calendar date, whether their bees actually need it or not, and why that approach can cause just as much damage as not treating at all. Bees have survived parasites and disease pressure for millions of years without any help from us. Our job was never to eliminate every threat they face. It's to notice the small signs early enough that we can actually do something useful with the time we have left before the season decides the outcome for us. I'll see you in the next one.